It's been about 5 years since I last built a new computer, but this time I wanted to build something that was small enough to fit in my entertainment unit underneath my TV, but also powerful enough to play games while not sacrificing performance or thermals. That's why I found the Silverstone RVZ03 Mini ITX case. Now this case has been around for a while, so it's missing a lot of the modern accoutrements like USB-C on the front panel. Instead, we've got two USB 3 Type A ports, as well as two 3.5mm jacks for old style headsets and microphones in case any of you out there are still using those. There's not a lot to love here for RGB fans. All there is one customizable RGB strip on the front panel. Now the case is plastic on the front and the sides with a couple of vents on the sides to help with airflow. The top and bottom panels are made of metal. The top panel has a grill in it and comes with a slimline fan to help cool your CPU. The bottom panel has two grills but only comes with one slimline fan, so if you want a second one you'll have to buy it and install it yourself. There's also a grill underneath there for your power supply. I'm not too sure why they made it look differently to both the others, but it is what it is.
Okay, so let's get started. The case isn't completely toolless, so you will need to use a Phillips head screwdriver to remove the two screws securing the top panel to the case. Once that's done, flip the case over and remove the 4 screws securing the power supply mount to the case. The mount should fall out when you pick up the case again. Don't worry, you're not going to break it. Slide your chosen power supply into the bracket, making sure the fan is facing downwards and the screw holes at the bottom line up with those on the bracket. In this case, haha, no pun intended, I have a 140mm fully modular 750W power supply from Silverstone. I would probably recommend going one smaller and getting an SFX PSU, just to give yourself a bit more clearance when it comes to plugging things in and cable management, but for that you'll need to get an ATX to SFX adapter sold separately from Silverstone, which I don't have.
Okay, so now let's talk about the video card bracket.
The video card bracket will support two 2.5-inch SSDs on one side and one 2.5-inch mechanical hard drive on the other. Here you'll also find the PCI Express GPU adapter for the motherboard. To start installing your GPU onto the bracket, first unscrew the dual slot covers with your handy dandy Phillips head screwdriver. Next, slide the included PCI Express extender onto the GPU. Then insert your GPU with the extender attached into the case's motherboard PCI Express adapter. After that's secure, the video card should be lined up perfectly with the dual slots on the adapter, so feel free to start screwing it into place. If you have a full-sized card and it's a little bit droopy like mine, you can use the included graphics card holder to support it. Just don't forget to screw it in once you've lined it up correctly, otherwise it'll just fall out. Yeah, take my word for that one. The top holder should fit neatly over the bottom holder with the two screw holes lining up nicely. Screw it in place, then give it a little wiggle to make sure both it and your GPU aren't going anywhere. Don't reinstall the GPU bracket just yet though. Put it aside for later, just like we did with the power supply. Wait, you haven't put the power supply back in yet, have you? Did I forget to mention that?
Alright, now that the motherboard's good to go, it's time to put it into our case.
Snap the I/O shield into place like so. No screws are required for a change, just a little bit of force and you should be able to push it straight in. Now this case already has risers for the motherboard pre-installed, so simply line up the corresponding screw holes on each corner of the motherboard with those on the risers and gently push your motherboard onto the I/O shield. I said gently. Are you sure you know what you're doing? There you go, you got it. Then screw in the board and being careful not to over tighten them in case you break the board.
Alright, well now that the motherboard's in, it's time to try putting the power supply back.
Make sure you plug the power cable in and turn the power supply on before you screw it back in, because you won't be able to do this once it's screwed in place. Trust me. If you've got a modular power supply like mine, don't do what I did and make sure you plug in any cables you might need before reinstalling the power supply. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble plugging them in with that LED controller in the way. Or you can just do what I suggested earlier and get a slim SFX power supply with the ATX to SFX adapter. Now, before reinstalling your GPU bracket, make sure all the front panel connectors are plugged into the motherboard since you won't be able to get to them once the GPU bracket is screwed in. The RGB cable should already be plugged into the controller, so go ahead and plug in the other end straight into the header on your motherboard. Sorry about that other big head that's in the way right there. Just trust me, I got it in. The case also comes with an included braided cable splitter to plug in both the GPU and CPU fans from the top panel into the fan header on your motherboard, although you may want to hold off on plugging in the CPU fan until right before you place the top panel back in place. Look, there's not a lot of clearance there, so it's harder than it looks. Now it's time to plug the front panel connectors into the motherboard, assuming you got them out from underneath the video card adapter in time. Keep in mind that your reset cable might already be plugged into the RGB controller, so the front LED strip is switchable via the front reset button. But if you want the reset button to actually reset your computer, you'll need to disconnect it from the RGB controller and plug it into your motherboard instead. Make sure you read your motherboard's manual so you know exactly where to plug in the front panel connectors. Once again, in this case, I'm finding there's not a lot of clearance for you to be able to plug this sort of stuff in, so it might take a while. The power and reset connectors can go in any orientation, but pay attention to the positive and negative icons on the hard drive LED connector, as you will need to plug it in the correct way as per your motherboard manual's instructions. Remember what I said earlier about plugging in the power supply's modular cables in before screwing the power supply back into the case? Well, this is why you do it, so you're not trying to squeeze them into the tiny gap that's left between the back of the power supply and the RGB controller bracket. If you've bought a half-decent power supply like I have, all the cables and their corresponding ports should be labelled. Start by first plugging in the largest 24-pin cable into its corresponding port on the motherboard. Then you'll need to connect an 8-pin power connector into one of the 8-pin plugs on the power supply. Once you've cut your hand a few times trying to plug that cable in, it should be fairly simple to plug the other end into its corresponding port on the motherboard. Check your motherboard's manual to see exactly where the 8-pin power plug is.
Okay, so now it's finally time to put the video card back in.
Now, if you want to install a mechanical 2.5-inch hard drive into the case, you're going to need to screw it into the GPU bracket. It won't fit into any of the SSD slots on top of the GPU bracket, trust me, I've tried, so you'll need to turn the bracket upside down and slide the hard drive into the spot underneath the GPU. Once the hard drive is in place, turn the GPU bracket back the right way around and screw the hard drive into place. After the hard drive is secured, plug in the SATA cable from your motherboard, the power cable from your power supply, and while you're at it you might as well plug in the power into your GPU because, and there seems to be a pattern emerging here, that you're not going to be able to do it later when the GPU bracket is back in place.
Okay, spoiler time. You may have noticed that in between installing the motherboard and installing the video card, there was also a change in video card. That's because I originally started the build with a Radeon ATI 5700, and after finishing the build, installing everything and trying to install the Radeon drivers, everything just went to hell. I kept getting black screens, a constant reboot, nothing would work. It would only fix it once I uninstalled those ATI drivers and reinstalled the default Windows ones. So I ended up refunding it and getting an Nvidia RTX 2060 Super instead. Still has that blower fan, and it's made by ASUS, which matches the rest of my hardware as well. And I haven't had a problem since.
Make sure there are no cables obscuring any vents or fans before placing the GPU bracket back in. Here you can see I've routed the front panel cables behind the LED controller and the PSU. And even with all the cables squared away, it can still be a bit difficult in this case to replace the GPU bracket with all of the video card's cables plugged in as well. But don't screw the bracket down just yet, as you'll have to make sure the GPU adapter slides into the PCI Express slot on your motherboard first. Once that's done, you should be able to just screw in the bracket. If it doesn't screw down properly first try, make sure you have all your cables out of the way, making sure that anything you need to plug into the motherboard has enough access to reach. Last but not least, the USB 3 and HD audio cables from the front panel need to be plugged into your motherboard. In my case, both literally and figuratively, the USB 3 cable plugged in right next to the power and LED plugs. The HD audio cable, however, didn't want to fit for some reason, so I just gave up on it. Who really needs those audio jacks on the front panel these days anyway? Now, if you've got a smaller power supply like I don't have, you should be able to tuck some of your excess cables in behind that. But I didn't, so I just had to settle for using the Velcro the power supply came with, tucking the cables around the sides of the motherboard and making sure I didn't obscure the CPU cooler and its fan. Remember that cable for the fan in the top of the case we left unplugged earlier? Well, now it's time to plug it back in. All that should be left to do now is slide the top panel back in place, making sure that the cable that you just plugged back in for the fan doesn't get in the way of said fan once it's in place.
I really like the build quality and the fact that it comes with a couple of fans, as well as the customizable LED strip along the front. However, even though this is one of the biggest HTPC cases that I could find at 14 litres, it's still a bit annoying to build in. And I'm not even talking about needing a smaller power supply when it says it can take a larger one. Cable management is made really hard by the fact that once that GPU bracket is in, it's impossible to move or adjust any of the cables that are underneath. And due to the clearance between the GPU bracket and the case, when trying to install that mechanical 2.5-inch hard drive in the slot underneath, I found myself having to bend those cables back right to the sockets because L-shaped cables wouldn't work. With it being an older case as well, it doesn't have any of the more modern connectors like USB-C on the front panel. So if you want those, you'll probably have to end up upgrading in a few years. Once everything's in, however, and you have managed to tidy up those cables and get them out of the way of those fans as well as you can, it all fits in quite nicely. If you like this video, don't forget to check out my other one where I actually put the hardware, CPU and motherboard and everything else together. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.